Welcome back, everyone. I'm really pleased to be able to introduce Chris Kucharik, who is a professor of plant and agroecosystem sciences. His research program is largely interdisciplinary, incorporating field work from cropping systems, ecology, and ecosystem modeling in a framework that is geared towards understanding the impacts of climate change and land management on the provisioning of ecosystem goods and services, more specifically crop and bioenergy feedstock production, water quality, quantity and quality, carbon sequestration, and climate regulation. So welcome, Chris. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. All right, so good afternoon. I get the privilege of starting after lunch, right? So try to stay with me. I'll keep it exciting, hopefully. So I'm actually, at the end, I'll have a link. This is actually research that was published earlier this year. So you'll be able to go back and read the publication, or you can contact me afterwards for that the talk is based upon. So the, I just need to click on the slide. Yeah. All right. So when we think about food, energy, water systems, obviously society and human well-being are dependent on these systems, but they're being threatened in unprecedented ways. The threats and the system shocks like climate change are exacerbated because of the linkages that exist between any one of those individual components. And it's going to take, as you've probably been hearing already about today, innovative and collaborative efforts to meet the future challenges and avoid abrupt, undesirable changes moving forward. And at the center of this is something that often gets lost in the shuffle is ecosystems, and that our few systems must become more resilient and capable of sustaining those ecosystems. Now, how we get to achieve few security is limited, although Randy Jackson probably let you know he's got an idea of how to do it. The effectiveness of policies and practices aimed to mitigate a lot of those effects of climate change and unsustainable land management is often unknown at this point. And the strategies also have to be tailored, to the heterogeneity in soils and climate and biodiversity and land use that we have ongoing. We've got to consider impacts to farmers, to farm workers, and rural communities. And there's a lot of uncertainty about just how much risk or cost that farmers and landowners and ag institutions might be willing to absorb to make that transition that's likely needed moving forward. And we know that the system change is difficult here, especially in the US when you think about a lot of our federal policies that support abundant and inexpensive food. Our supply chains for food and bioenergy are optimized to be highly productive, which often promotes low resilience to disruption. And our federal disaster responses, in particular like crop insurance, further lock us into the vulnerability that the systems have to future shocks as we continue to try to farm degraded landscapes, places that flood. I think you get the point. And some of the figures here showing a report that came out earlier this year and this fall from the Environmental Working Group showing how those indemnities and those payments have been escalating. And if you took this and looked even further back, you'd see an even more exponential increase in those payments. So oftentimes our short-term policies are problematic because they don't take a long view, and historically we've incentivized single sectors of the food, energy, water nexus, which can then create other unforeseen problems down the road. So what I wanted to do was to take a focus on the Mississippi Basin here and illustrate a few examples of one-dimensional historical policies and how they contributed to unanticipated and negative consequences to ecosystems. Hopefully I can offer some lessons for achieving few security and present a few principles and strategies for developing innovative policies that promote the resilience of ecosystems and few security moving forward. So just to orientate you just on the geography of the Mississippi Basin and all that it encompasses. So there's 91 million people that live here. a sizable proportion of the United States. It's home to obviously a lot of corn and soybean production and a diversity of a lot of other ecosystems and flora and fauna. So the three stories and examples that I'm going to focus on deal with wetland drainage, promotion of groundwater irrigation, and then cropland extensification as examples of programs that led to unintended consequences to ecosystems. So the first with wetland drainage. So the idea here is that the policies promoted expanded cropland but reduced water quality. So back in about the mid-1800s and even before that, the idea was that the federal government wanted to boost the agricultural economy and feed a growing population. And there were a series of acts before the time of the Civil War that coincided with westward migration, try to get people to come onto the Great Plains and some other locations. And that basically allowed state governments to assume control of the federal land if they agreed to drain and convert it to other land uses. And unfortunately, about 60 to 80% of the original wetland area has been lost, and in particular, most of that between 1780 and the 1980s. And 80% of that land had been converted over to support agricultural land use. So the map on the left is just showing and highlighting the states, particularly the I-states in Missouri and Ohio, where more than 85% of that original wetland area was lost. As time went on and new technologies became possible, and that supported more of that westward migration, dredging and digging drainage ditches and putting in tile drainage in the 40s and beyond became more commonplace. So the second idea is that groundwater irrigation increased food production, but also increased fossil fuel use and decreased water supply. And again, this coincided with increasing national food security goals that drove federal support for groundwater supply irrigation. And there were a couple of acts in the later 1800s, the Timber Culture Act and then the Desert Land Act, that promised expanded land ownership title to settlers, first if trees were planted or if landowners irrigated their land via ditches. And then as time went on, there was federal support to study and survey and estimate groundwater availability in the 1880s through the Great Plains. And then as we move further through time, drought in the 1930s, farm mechanization, advances in technology, pump and center pivot technologies, and then rural electrification fueled a boom in irrigation development in the 40s and 50s that then lasted for several decades after that. But before we talk about the impacts of irrigation on water, I want to draw attention to this great book, and if you haven't seen it, this is by Opie et al., Ogallala, Water for a Dry Land. There were already indications early on in our history that the Great Plains were not going to be an easy place to farm. This quote, a forever dangerous and useless place deserving only to be passed by. In the 1780s, we've got James Monroe telling Thomas Jefferson that the entire U.S. west of the Appalachians was no bargain. And by the time we move forward and learn some lessons, the extensive areas of the Great Plains must be classed as unsuited to be sustained cultivated crops and should there ever never have been plowed, which obviously came after the Dust Bowl had happened. So you think about all that promotion of migration and settlement to the west, and we ended up with another unintended consequence. And obviously the Dust Bowl led us to actually making some good choices and decisions moving forward in terms of land restoration. This slide is just pointing out from the mid-30s to the early 40s how the Civilian Conservation Corps had worked to plant shelter belt areas through the Great Plains to help with that wind erosion problem that had happened once we plowed the sod under the Great Plains and started farming it. But in this chapter in writing by Andrew Watson, he points to that the single most important factor is likely fossil fuel energy and introduction, electrification, natural gas reserves in the Great Plains that made it able to be pulling and drawing large amounts of water out of that aquifer to the surface so we could farm, and how it would take about 6,000 years to replenish that natural resource, unfortunately. And the map on the right points to the water level changes, the shades of yellow and brown and pinks and reds show a decline, of anywhere from 20 to 100 or more feet over that time period of the second half of the 20th century. And then the last policy has to do with the renewable fuel standard. So increased energy dependence, possibly. I guess the authors and I of this article thought that that's possible, but it did reduce water quality and a host of other ecosystem services. So I think the federal subsidization of corn ethanol is a prime example of, conflict between food, energy, water goals. So we're devoting about 40% of the annual corn crop each year to produce first generation corn grain ethanol. This all started with the U.S. Energy Policy Act in the early 2000s that established the renewable fuel standard and mandated increasing a minimum amount of ethanol to be blended with gasoline through 2022. It set a target of 36 billion gallons, of which 15 billion gallons of that could be first generation biofuel, and then more advanced and cellulosic biofuels would fill the gap after 2015. But unfortunately, the latest stats suggest, cellulosic biofuels have taken longer to take off, and only about 3% of the renewable fuel in 2020 was supported by that. And there's been a whole host of studies that have documented shortcomings in the renewable fuel standard. Some of that has come out of research right here at UW-Madison. This is research from Holly Gibbs' lab and Tyler Lark on the right, showing increased corn acreage due to the renewable fuel standard. That's in thousands of acres. So, large tracts of land from 2008 to 2016, after that act kind of went into place, played a dominant role in land use change. And here's another slide from Tyler and Holly's group that, a lot of that cropland that was converted was intact grasslands. So 80% of that new cropland came from grasslands, and over 2 million acres of those grasslands were intact, which means they hadn't been previously planted or plowed, or are most likely to have contained native species and sod at the time. So you might look at that map and say, oh, there's plenty to spare, but we're at a point in time we don't want to be going in that direction. We'd rather be restoring and conserving that land. We went on and published a study that came out a year ago or so that took a sort of a backward view and looked at a lot of the environmental outcomes of that over the 15 years. And basically what these figures are showing is in each of those, we've increased something. So increasing the amount of land and corn area, we've increased carbon emissions, the amount of nitrogen fertilizer going on the landscape, the amount of nitrate leaching going into the groundwater system, also the amount of phosphorus and sediment and soil erosion that's occurring on the landscape because of that diversion of previous land like in CRP or other grasslands and prairie back over to a monoculture row crop, unfortunately. So, to this point, what have we learned? Well, I think we've learned that, previous management of individual few components has failed to build long-term resilience of few systems, and that future policy has to consider integrated responses in a changing environment, and then the feedbacks that happen across those scales. And there's a lot going on simultaneously. So changing drivers like climate, shifting land use, fluctuations in resource stocks, and then some of our technological advances are sort of cementing us in and ensuring us that things that we're sort of working on in the past and those currently under development in terms of solutions are not going to last forever because it's a moving target, unfortunately. And then we have to think about developing policies and solutions that at the center protect ecosystems, promote those multifunctional landscapes, and we need the support and the will to implement them at scales that matter. So I'm just going to walk through 3 principles that we came up with. So in terms of how we move forward. So the first is to value and promote the importance of non-provisioning ecosystem services and the connection of natural and semi-natural ecosystems to few. So we have to acknowledge the interconnectedness of food, energy, water, and ecosystems. We want to increase diversity, the ability to adapt, and also the complexity in these landscapes. So they have the capacity to adapt to rapid environmental changes. This might mean incorporation of more perennial grass systems along with forests and restoration of wetlands. Those can all help increase soil carbon, reduce runoff and nutrient losses, and reduce flooding. And then those more complex landscapes also support increased biodiversity, a diversity of birds and pollinator abundance, and then also suppress some agricultural pests that are moving further north in a warming climate. Second has to do with location. So identifying keystone locations and create solutions that are tailored yet scalable. And what do we mean by that? Well, with a lot of advances in geospatial information, AI is one of those things, I think that's entering into the picture. Trade-offs can start to be minimized a bit better, and we can start identifying places on the landscape where we get more bang for our buck in making a land use change. And also have the ability to do this at finer scale. So you think about the conversion of small amount of ag land to semi-natural elements that yields disproportionate benefits. And then for success, those local solutions must lead to positive impacts at a larger scale. Unfortunately, there's a lot of things that we do at fine scale, either at a research plot or an individual farm, that shows promise in terms of maybe reducing runoff or erosion. But when we start to implement those across a larger landscape, they don't scale. And the Yahara watershed here is a perfect example of millions of dollars in better management practices going in to try to reduce basically phosphorus loading into the Yahara River and the lakes here, and that there's really been no decrease or trend downward in that loading since the early 80s when they set a goal of about a 50% reduction. And a lot of that has to do with a changing climate, and that some of those solutions are not as effective as we increase our precipitation and have more extreme events like we had, if you remember, in August of 2018 around here, if you're from the region. We also want to think about incorporating indigenous and local knowledge, as we move forward in identifying these places. And third, we want to take the long view and prioritize incentives that improve production and farm profitability, but also ecosystem health. And I think that means taking a holistic approach that prioritizes financial incentives and commitments that work towards improving health. And that probably means reorientating incentives to create new market opportunities. So we're all familiar probably with carbon offsets and paying farmers for sequestering carbon. But what happened if we rewarded farmers for promoting and supporting clean water? Crop insurance reforms would go a long way. Maybe if we could reform those and we could incentivize farmers to adopt more conservation and diversification of their practices. We need to rethink programs right now that make conservation and ecosystem preservation just naturally inherent in food, energy, water ecosystems, and shift away from the goal of maximizing production and ensuring farmer profitability through lower inputs and conservation incentives. So I wish I could stand up here and tell you how to do that through policy. I'm not a policy decision maker, but I have worked kind of at that crux of science and policy and had an opportunity to talk to policy decision makers. And I think, what I've learned and what my colleagues have learned is that historically a lot of those policies are developed siloed, thinking about food or thinking about water or thinking about energy independently of one another. And we have to think about innovative policy that integrate, food, energy, water, and ecosystem considerations and account for short-term and long-term changes and feedbacks that hopefully enhance resilience. And we get to the point where, the silo is just one underneath the umbrella that we, think about future development of those policies. And so the true costs and the power is shared by a society, and the true costs don't fall to just those that are less wealthy, and that this helps promote, sustainable systems moving forward. I think that helps support thriving local and rural economies, increases biodiversity, and other things as we look to the future. So in summary, we have to think about, these solutions. We've got to sustain farmers, communities, our supplies of food and bioenergy, as well as ecosystems, and reduce those environmental impacts. We got to take a long view. We've got to be adaptable to the unforeseen feedbacks, value natural and semi-natural ecosystems, promote non-provisioning ecosystem services, and also acknowledge that a lot of times we look back in the historical record at analogs that can be used to help us learn about the future. And unfortunately, the idea of stationarity is dead means that really we don't have a lot of analogs in the past that are useful in the future when we think about a changing climate. It's sad, but unfortunately true. So I mentioned a lot of this talk and the details came from a publication that came out in Frontiers in Ecology and the Environment earlier this year by my co-authors, which included Eric Booth, Steve Lohide, Rebecca Power, Adina Rissman, Jenny Seifert, and Monica Turner. And if you want to learn more about the work that we're doing, the NSF is funding a project through their Innovation of Food, Energy, Water Systems program. We call it Fewscapes here. You can go to fewscapes.wisc.edu. We're right in the middle of working with scenarios development exercise with stakeholders. We actually have a couple of workshops next week scheduled where we're going to get some feedback on some future scenarios for the Upper Mississippi River Basin and moving forward with our models on that. So I'm going to stop there and take any questions. So yeah, go ahead, Tim. Yeah.
Can you expand on your definition of non-provisioning for the audience?
So beyond just, because it's easier to look at a slide. So you immediately think about food and maybe, biofuels as sort of like things that, products we're deriving from the landscape. And non-provisioning would be like climate and air quality regulation. I'm, looking at examples up here. Biodiversity, water flow regulation, things like that. So things that maybe get a little less attention in the planning.
So follow up.
Yeah.
I know that the biofuels industry is clamoring for levelized playing field with other renewable energy sources in terms of their program is being determined by carbon intensity as the metric. I know for a fact with my work with the corporates that they're all looking at their supply chains and saying, ideally, we'd like to buy product that's labeled with a carbon intensity number.
Right.
The EU just published today their sustainability disclosure standards for all products. And I know that's driving the bus in most of the policy world. How do you see those kinds of things, the labeling, the carbon intensity metrics and measuring, factoring into the fuel?
Yeah.
Scope?
Yeah, well, I'll say what I think, and then maybe others in the room, want to add to that. But I remember 20 years ago when I first started working on carbon sequestration, this thought came up and it, never materialized, probably because cap and trade and that never materialized either, and these voluntary markets went away. But I think the discussion was always in the background, but I think it started to expand beyond carbon. It was also like, well, what about your water, footprint? Seems logical, right? So I think we're at a different time now, though, and this groundswell of, the attention that like the carbon and sequestration and carbon crediting is getting now that versus where it was 20 years ago is way order of magnitude higher, I think. And I'm hoping that the water quantity and quality issues that we're all facing start to gain, more attention and maybe become a part of that discussion. Beyond that, I don't know how you factor in some of these other metrics like biodiversity and flood regulation and that, but it'd be nice if there was one number on the product that accounted for everything that's on the flower diagrams, right? Yeah.
One last comment. USDA is about to release its new blue book, which is the methods and practices and data and science blue book on you do practice X, you generate carbon savings Y. That's about to be released just any day.
Yeah.
And having the outcome of all the work that you have done and the team has done in this, in reviewing that science and that methodology would be really a valuable contribution.
Oh, thanks. Yeah. Diane?
Oh, well, I just wanted, to think back to what Rob Annex was saying this morning about when you do those life cycle assessments, which is how you figure out that carbon intensity, your model matters enormously.
Hugely.
And those models always hugely simplify, and we keep getting into trouble with that. We have to do it, but we also have to be clear-eyed about the limitations of doing that. And so, yeah.
Mary,
one label on a
can we
product.
crawl down this rabbit hole just a second? Maybe for a minute.
We have like we are a little, minute or two. I think there's one
Maybe
other
save it for
question
later,
too.
then, okay.
Excuse me. I just have one similar question about the presentations earlier. We were talking about a sense of place and how a lot of these different environmental factors are driven by location, and just how do we get our hands around that, knowing that every place, not only locally, regionally, nationally, is going to be different in trying to understand some of the concepts you laid out here.
That makes federal policy difficult, right? Because it's often one size fits all.
Right.
And I think that's painted us into a corner in many respects. So I don't know how we change that, if that has to come down more at the state level or even beyond that in terms of developing those. But yeah, I think you make a good point. Yeah. Mm-hmm. All right, you guys want to get back on track?
Thank you, Chris.
Yeah, you're welcome.